Well, thank you everyone for joining us today in what is the latest in the Millennial Insight series online. If you don't know Millennial is a family of brands, and you can see a list of all those brands in front of you there. We are a company that designs and manufactures products to support people where they get healed, where they learn, where they live, and where they work. We have a strong history of research, and I'm part of the Research and Insights team. And so is our speaker today, who is Dr. Michelle Osman. Michelle is Director of our Healthcare Knowledge Innovation at Millennial. And Michelle is a social spatial scientist. I knew I'd struggle with that, and former nurse practitioner, and dedicating to improving health through rigorous research and design. Now, as a healthcare person, it's been really interesting to see the research that she's done around this subject of hospitality. I've already enjoyed the talk once. I'm looking forward to it again. It is superb. I ask you to use the chat box for questions. Feel free to put them in as you go along, and any observations that you may have as you go along. And for those that ask, yes, you will get a slide deck, you will get a follow-up email, and you will get Michelle's contact details. Michelle, over to you. Looking forward to a great session, and thank you everyone for joining us.
Thanks so much, Mark. Just to make sure everyone can hear me. Hope so. All right, so this talk is titled Hospitality and Workplace Design, More Than Just Food and Drink. And as Mark shared, I come from the world of healthcare, and I've often commented that the issues facing healthcare organizations are really in lockstep with that of workplace, and I think hospitality is no different. I do think it's important to share that the genesis of this work came from a call for papers at a conference focused on US government healthcare. And their call for papers was titled Hospitality, Bringing the Patients Back. And we're hearing very much from our workplace colleagues that they're attempting to do the same thing, hospitality to entice employees. And the question I had at that time, and it's the same here, which is to say, what does hospitality really mean? I had always thought of, hotels, well-appointed spaces, tuned atmospheric surprise and delight. And it occurred to me, is that all? And I think you'll find, as I certainly did, that true hospitality, which I'm going to call here capital H hospitality, is really so much more. So just to briefly go over this course description, and many of you have already seen this in the invite, that hospitality really has devolved, that generic term, and we're going to explore different ways that we can identify what hospitality really is so that we can then design for it. Learning objectives, just so you know, this will be a healthcare CEU. And if you are interested in the healthcare specific version, that will be available later this fall, and you can contact any of your Herman Miller contacts to hear that if that's interesting to you. So these learning objectives, in this case, to look at the historic and philosophical rationales, relate these layouts as core to hospitality-based design, show that it really is the cornerstone of diversity and inclusion. That may be, I think, novel for many of us. And then the role of the affordances for employees. So, again, this term and the title, Beyond Food, Drink, and Accommodation. So during my research process, I discovered that while it is more than food, drink, and accommodation, it still is about meeting people's basic needs, those which make us human, right? And I do want to point out, this is not a literature review. This is a concept review. So I started with Google Scholar, finding the seminal pieces in the literature that discuss the underpinnings of hospitality. I used a snowball approach, which is to say I looked for the pieces and the authors that kept coming up again and again as those key thought leaders, and went to the original sources to make sure I had this concept just right. I looked at the major schools of hospitality, Tisch at NYU, hospitality at Cornell, for the key faculty and their writings and conference presentations to make sure that this was as contemporary as possible while going back to see where it originated. And so in essence, I went from hospitality generally to look at hospitality in healthcare and in workplaces specifically, so that then we can say, all right, what are the design implications? How might we relate these core principles of hospitality to the needs of organizations, employees, consultants, clients, and customers? Now, there may be sources that you know of that I've missed, and if you have, please let us know. I would love to learn more and build on this piece. I do think you're going to find two main things from this talk. And the first is that hospitality is fundamental to who we are as humans. And that, I think, is the overarching principle here. And secondly, that hospitality really has been muddied and misappropriated by the industry and by academics. So we're going to start with the historical beginnings of hospitality across continents, cultures, and religions. Look at the fundamentals of hospitality and differentiate it from intent. We're going to look at the academic literature again and show how it's both cultural and social, domestic and private, and then deeply get into how it is we might design. So let's get started. I think that part of this issue that we've struggled with hospitality when we get asked quite often is that it really doesn't quite deliver. And John Caputo makes this point because it is confusing in that being everywhere, it's nowhere, right? The term is thrown about to describe really anything that may include an experience with a coffee urn on a table, right? That is hospitality oftentimes. And I think by looking at the history to begin with, we're going to see it is fundamentally so much more. So the hospitality. Again, deeply a human embedded activity. And historically, the requirement to demonstrate hospitality, as Lashley describes, is a major theme of human moral systems across the globe and time. And it is the feature of almost all nations across the world. So to begin, it's a core trait in world religions, right? So this duty and obligation to provide hospitality to strangers is a key element in most religions. There's this common theme and stories of guests, right, turning out to be God or gods or angels, right? So that one would provide hospitality to this stranger at the door is fundamental to that work. So in Hinduism, which of course predates Abrahamic religions, tradition would teach that no matter how poor one is, one should always offer 3 items: sweet words, a sitting place, and refreshments, right? Even a glass of water. In Judaism, the Israelite experience of movement and being, a constant stranger. Scholars argue that in Judaic cultures there was this keen sense that was developed, a sense for and a need for hospitality. For the Buddha, hospitality should be shown to all, right? Whatever their caste, religious affiliation, or status. For Christianity, the Greco-Roman customs of hospitality seem to have fueled that growth of the early church. And Henry Nouwen, who many of you may be familiar with, really brings out the notion of hospitality meaning freedom and friendship for all, right? Allowing space to be themselves. And Islam, the true believer offers hospitality to strangers at the door. And of course, all must be welcomed with respect, regardless of their belief or family tie. So I could have added more world religions. I could only fit about 5 on the slide and make it legible. But even if you go back to Shintoism, Hinduism, all those world religions really come down to these principles of providing that safety and security to the stranger, inviting them into the home, and getting to know them and providing for them. It's across geographies. Now, I in this case, in bringing up the indigenous peoples of Australia and North America for one particular reason. I could have picked any, but in this case, it's because of their relative geographic isolation. Ethnographers, anthropologists believe that the indigenous peoples of Australia in particular were unexposed to other cultures for around 40,000 years. And even so, the general principles of hospitality that those cultures expressed are identical to what we find throughout the world, right? This welcoming of outsiders, treating them with respect and kindness, providing them shelter. It really is everywhere. The same thing to be true in the indigenous peoples of North America, especially talking about the sharing and exchange of conversation and experiences. So again, throughout geography. expressed in architecture. And many in this call will be familiar with the notion of architecture, the boundaries enforcing that ritual arrival. We certainly see this even today. The hotel lobbies, the monumental stairs, all of these are designed to create an impression and to generate the sense of you have crossed into the threshold of this new experience. Layout, we also know, communicates the guest's relative status to the host, right? The higher ranking you are, more important guests are admitted to more private inner areas. And we see this across design today, right? As you move deeper into the plan, spaces tend to reflect a more critical or technical program. We definitely see this in patient care areas, which get deeper into the plan. Higher ranked CEOs, again, deeper into the plan. Architecture is really used in that case to provide protection and to delineate status. So again, expressed in architecture. We could give a whole talk just on that. Reflected in language, right? Even the word itself, hostis to hospice, this transformation of stranger to guest. And scholars really comment on how, while the word inverts, so does the relationship. The goal is when the stranger crosses the threshold, they become a guest in the same way that the word has transformed and goes from a person that you would shun once they are a stranger to bringing them in, and it's such that under no conditions can that stranger, now guest, be disparaged. So, quite in our language. This last one I found fascinating, that hospitality is even embedded in our literature. Scholars comment that the Odyssey, many of you may have had recent high schoolers that have been exposed to this body of work. The Odyssey is essentially a book on the pitfalls of violating hospitality. Over and over again, each tragedy, right, that happens is because a guest or a host has not observed those expected customs. Shakespeare used host-guest drama in 16 of his 37 plays. And the treachery was enhanced because, again, the character would break those widely accepted notions of behavior between the host and the guest. The most famous one is Macbeth, where King Duncan is killed while a guest in Macbeth's home. And the audience at that time would have known that is just the height of treachery, right? Because there again was this expectation and this very, very deep understanding at the human level, what is to be expected when you're a host, when you're a guest. And I think Jacques Derrida summed it up most beautifully when sharing that there is no culture that is not also a culture of hospitality. It is, in fact, culture itself. So again, as I shared at the beginning, that it really does come down to being who we are as humans. So moving on to the meaning of hospitality. And I think you'll see, again, from what we just did, revisiting the literature, that it is this common set of activities and behaviors. Now, scholars may debate definitions, exact revisions of the meaning, but they do ultimately agree on a common set. And so we'll look at some of the definitions. Here I have 6. I think you'll find multiple slightly different variations. Is it private or public? Is it really something that's experienced in ambience and behavior? To what extent is psychological comfort a part of it? Is it an exchange of goods, the management of strangers? All these different definitions, I think, still do have one piece in common. And Brotherton nicely explains that, which is to define it as hospitality is really a relationship between hosts and guests. And I think we really need to remember that it's about the relationship between hosts and guests that really underpins most about what we're going to talk about today, which is to say it is a human interaction. I don't think I can stress that enough. A human interaction that is characterized by being contemporaneous, voluntary, mutually beneficial, all based on specific products and services. Services can be just about anything, and we'll describe that in a moment. Now, Lashley and many of these other authors would argue that all of these, to be sure, somewhat overlapping elements have got to be present for that hospitality relationship, right? That there is this essence and they need to all be there at the same time. One can't pick and choose and somehow get hospitality. In fact, I think that's where we get some of the confusion and the muddiness when one has just chosen rather willy-nilly. So first, hospitality is human interaction, and it's not just provisional, right? Authors over and over again have made the case and given examples that yes, in a grocery store, for example, you might procure food and drink, right? But it isn't this exchange where one is providing it to you. There's no interaction there of being shared and giving. So again, drawing that relationship and the difference in something that is provisional versus that human interaction. Now, I do think we can discuss whether or not we think robots and chatbots will emerge as sufficiently human to satisfy interaction. And I do bring that up late at the very end in terms of an open question. But Ritzer in 2007 had a super interesting comment to make about this, whether or not these corporate drivers, right, to increase efficiency and predictability that you certainly get, right, from the robots and chatbots, ultimately create a barrier to the performance, if you will, of hospitality. And he actually calls it the McDonaldizing, right, the McDonald's, food corporation, right, that those processes might inhibit performances which are in fact hospitable. And so I do wonder whether or not there's a bit of a tension, right, between what is efficient and what is hospitality. We'll get to that later. I think that's an open point for discussion. The next, that hospitality is contemporaneous. I did not expect in any way to discover that hospitality is spatial. Over and over again, authors comment that space, co-presence, is inextricably linked to hospitality. There has to be this person-to-person, host-guest together. There's this togetherness, that the spatial relationship that differentiates true hospitality from any of its other, simulacras, if you will. That it is voluntary, right? As we saw over and over again, the host didn't welcome the stranger at the door because they didn't want to, right? It was this moral imperative, this duty to give. Now, I do think that motive can play a part here, and we'll unpack that a little bit later in terms of the different motives for a voluntary giving of hospitality. But again, it is voluntary. It is mutually beneficial, right? That it is reciprocal. The host has to be open to what the guest has to offer and vice versa. There is this notion that presence emerges as a giving, not just of an object or of an expectation of future repayment, but giving of self. And then lastly, provision and consumption. Certainly not just of goods, right? Protection, provision of protection that is both physical and psychological. This obligation to provide security is key to hospitality. And authors over and over again bring up this notion that security is really the #1 requirement of hospitality. And again, I don't think that that's where most of us have placed security, right, in the hospitality bucket. I certainly would have, and safety and healthcare is, our #1 brand promise. But I guarantee you, no one is talking about it in terms of hospitality. So that's a shift even for those of us in healthcare. I do wish to comment that hospitality is not just hospital intent. And this is really, really important, right? Authors comment that receptionists, salespeople, and secretaries in manufacturing and service companies, these folks would all be expected to welcome and deal with visitors in a hospitable manner, but wouldn't necessarily be expected to provide hospitality, right? We do wish to meet someone's needs, to help those in trouble. Like all those desires are good, but are not hospitality. I would also comment that it is not servicescapes, healthscapes. We talk about this, right? Atmospherics, physical design, delight. Now, this is not to say that those things are not important, right? Beauty, delight, form, texture, all those things are important, but not necessarily hospitality. And I will say it is confusing in the literature, and I've spent quite a bit of time looking at the healthcare literature in particular on this, where hospitality is the measure, but if you look at what the authors are actually measuring, they're measuring satisfaction or loyalty or willingness to pay. And as we've seen from looking into what hospitality really is, they're not really related. I'm not saying they're not important, but it's not the same thing. And what I'm making the point here is we should just be clear what we're talking about, right? Just so that we know what we're measuring and how to know whether or not it works. So I think in reviewing what hospitality is that it's pretty clear that it's about fundamental human needs. And as I was reviewing all this work, what really came to mind is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And I'm sure many of you have come to that same conclusion, right? I mean, do you recognize them? You know, at the bottom rung, physiological, that we have air, water, food, shelter, right? All those at that basic level. We have safety, right? Personal security, resources, employment and property, love and belonging, that friendship, sense of connection, esteem, right, and self-actualization. And so, you know, as we provide hospitality, that's what we're really getting to, is providing for fundamental human needs. So the domains of hospitality. You know, how do we operationalize that? It can get really confusing, and there are several ways to approach it. As you might imagine, if you start to look at hospitality in terms of the business type, right? Hospitality in a hospital, hospitality in a hotel, hospitality in an office, in a home, you start to really get narrow in terms of the designing mind. In design school, I was taught that we design with verbs, not nouns, right? Famously, don't design a kitchen, design a place where people want to eat, right? And so in designing for eating, we're going to look at some of these domains of hospitality generically, so that we can then apply them to the different settings that any of us may be looking at. So the domains of hospitality. There is, on the bottom left, the cultural and social. This has to do with the dealing of strangers, right? The mutuality, status, and prestige. Then to the top, the domestic and private. This is more, you get the host-guest obligation, more about symbolic ties, creating that sense of mutual obligation. And then the commercial, right? The commercial is made by having, and the capital H in the middle, hospitality, merging the cultural and the domestic with this rationale that the service interaction is driven by an economic incentive. And the motive there gets really, really important, because it's a little bit confusing, right? Because hotels, restaurants, and bars and other venues, they're businesses, right? Where there's this relationship between a seller and a buyer. I mean, they're technically not a guest, right? They're a customer. And the relationship is philanthropic, and nothing about it is not philanthropic. It's economic. So, you know, it can muddy it when you're asking someone to believe that, you know, it's mutual and voluntary, but you really want that number 5 checkbox in terms of giving great service or getting paid for it. So it does get a little bit muddy when we look at some of the motives, and we'll unpack those here briefly. So again, Lashley has this really delightful way of thinking about it, the sort of spectrum, if you will. That on the left, we have the ulterior motives hospitality. I think we're all familiar with this one. The best example is the business lunch or dinner, right? Where the guest benefits the host potentially, and the hospitality is offered as a means to gain that benefit. The next is containing hospitality. And this is motivated a bit by stranger danger, that whole idea that you keep the stranger close so you can monitor them and see, you know, what they're about. Commercial, we're familiar with this one. This is the transactional version that we've seen. Reciprocal, this is offered on the basis of the understanding that hospitality will be reciprocated at a later date. The Romans were rather famous for this. Of course, there were no hotels and lodgings at that time, and so it was very common for Roman guests to provide hospitality in one's home, only to expect that to be reciprocated at some future date. And then altruistic. This is this act of generosity and benevolence. Now, authors do argue that you can certainly have multiple motives existing at the same time, and that simply because there is a commercial element, for example, doesn't mean the altruistic doesn't coexist. A good example is the surgeon who is fighting for her patient's life. You know, are those motives altruistic? Of course. Now, will that surgeon be well paid for that procedure? No doubt, right? So there is this overlap that can occur. Just to keep that in mind, that is where some of the suspicions, some of the mistrust, if you will, can take place if one isn't really careful about being clear what the motives are in giving hospitality. So as I pointed out and discussed at the very, very beginning, much like capital A architecture, now I always think about the capital A architects defining themselves as the true designers, the true architects, if you will. We're looking for capital H hospitality. And going forward, that's what I mean when I'm talking about hospitality, not this muddied sense, but defined as we have the host-guest relationship that is characterized as we've just discussed. So on to the host-guest relationship. So who is who, right? Who's the guest? Who's the host? I think that can be confusing sometimes. If you've already noticed, we talked about it being spatial. The host invites someone in. So what does that mean? And I think we already know. The host-guest relationship is defined by who owns the territory, right? The host owns the territory, and that really is the differentiation here. So you can see, therefore, that hospitality is really profoundly spatial. And this is a great way to think about it, as Rivers describes, that a guest can't be a guest where he has rights and responsibilities. Another, to flip it on its head, a host is only so on the territory where he claims authority, right? So as an example, if someone comes to your home and you're the host, likely that guest isn't going to start rummaging through your cupboards and going upstairs into your master bedroom, right? Because they know that they're the guest. They don't have those abilities to go into those spaces, and they have no authority. So what I found so fascinating about hospitality is, I think we've discussed here so far, is that hospitality is spatial. That had never occurred to me. And I was just delighted to discover that it really is this territorial relationship that then we can operate within, and gives us the opportunity then to design for. So who is the host? In workplaces, most certainly leadership and employees. Now, in healthcare, we start to add additional layers in, where the patient and family may have a hosting opportunity when they own their patient room. And if you'd like to learn more about that, please join us in the fall. But again, we're going to look at leaders and employees as being hosts in this case. And I think it's really nice to look at it in terms of a nesting relationship, right? Now, as with all models, the map is not the territory, and a model is just that, right? This is a way to think about the complexity of hospitality, which is really embodied, right? It requires this human presence. So we have these leaders, leadership really are responsible for both employees and the visitor that may happen to come into one's building or one space. They have that sort of macro responsibility for hospitality. We'll go into that in a bit. And then employees, as guests, if you will, of leadership, who also have the opportunity to take hosting responsibilities. And I do think there's this differentiation between resident employees and the new and non-resident employees. And we'll get into that more. And I hope we can have a really interesting discussion about this later in the session. So when leadership hosts employees. Now remember, right, this is about the relationship between the host and guest. It's territorially bound, it's spatially proximal, right? There's all these exchanges going on. And leadership really is in the position through humans, right? Through their leaders, if you will, who are agents of the organization, to bring forth that safety and security. They're really responsible for creating the affordances to bring that security as a means of hospitality. So, for example, at the height of COVID, right, a lot of attention on air quality and cleanliness as infectious potential that we wanted to prevent the spread of COVID-19, and certainly influenza and any other communicable disease that may come into the office. That's a part of that leadership at that macro level makes possible and operationalizes through people. Psychological security, which I'll get into more deeply in a moment. Physical comfort, right? Meeting the needs for food, water, nursing rooms, for example, lactation rooms. Those are a key part of that. And creating hosting opportunities, right? Where and how can the leadership start to move employees from being guests to being hosts, right? Leaders at that level create and make that possible, right? The average employee isn't going to be designing or deciding on the layout or the opportunities that are available in one's workplace, right? That happens at that macro level. So there really is this macro level of leadership where they're creating those hosting opportunities. Then when employees host other employees, this can be a team leader hosting a team, right, at that level, within and between team. We know from Gallup that the most important factor driving employee engagement is that immediate leader. So how is that immediate leader the host of his or her work team that he or she leads? From a hosting gradient, right? There is that gradient we talked about, sort of resident to newer or contingent worker. We bring in contingent workers, contractors. There is that transition, right? When they come in as strangers, we don't know them at all, moving them from a guest to a host at varying degrees and at various rates. It does occur to me that in the advent of hot desking and flexible work arrangements, the potential to own the territory and to feel like you're the host, might move to zero. And to what extent does the staff do employees remain in guest status? I think that's a really interesting question for us to think about. Aside from the leader hosting the team within that immediate team, there is this notion of employees hosting other employees. And if you're not familiar with Danny Meyer's book, Setting the Table, I can't recommend it enough. He spends a lot of time unpacking how teamwork, right, is really the main mechanism by which employees show teamwork, show hospitality to other team members. And we certainly see this at the healthcare level, where clinicians, if you've had a really tough day, you've just lost a patient, you need to be hosted, you're vulnerable, right? And how other employees can in that moment host you, and how the environment might help that hosting activity to take place. So there's a really interesting opportunity here, I think, in built environment where we might make this possible. And then lastly, when employees host visitors, and we're all familiar with this, providing for security and safety, physical comfort, and belonging, of course. Now, in this case, there is no expectation to convert them to hosts, right? We would expect that someone who's just coming for a half an hour is going to remain a visitor, going to remain a guest. Now, in healthcare, this is a little bit different, right? Where we do hope our patient and family guests, visitors, can feel enough agency and ownership to take on some of those host responsibilities, giving them that sense of agency and control in a place where they don't have a lot, right? So it's different, I think, in different environments, but a good place for us to start an interesting conversation. So Dr. Carol King at 95 had a really interesting way of putting this, that the hospitable organization must extend it to its guests, must extend hospitality to its host employees, certainly not its guests. And Danny Meyer comments that understanding the wants and needs of one's employees and delivering them in a safe environment with dignity is really critical to providing hospitality for staff, for employees. So how do we do the practice, right? What is the practice of hospitality and designing for it, right? Now that we know the underpinnings, the host-guest relationship, the domains, I'm going to share some let us design for ideas, right? Because these are relational. We're not designing for a single user, right? I want to say this is an initial pass. There are going to be some overlap in concepts, but this is for a team of designers and folks in the real estate domain, in human resources. Many of us are familiar with how it is we might bring hospitality to our own organizations. So I'm not going to show you pretty pictures of layouts that are specifically designed, but more, please do approach these as how might we accomplish the practice of hospitality in our spaces, and using these phrases, if you will, to help us think creatively. So I think Jamie Reeves put it beautifully when she broke down the fundamentals of the practice of hospitality in these three ways, which is to say it is protection, intellectual welcome, and table fellowship. And I'm going to unpack several ideas for how it is we might do this for our leaders and employees in our workplaces. So the first is hospitality is protection. How might we design for employee and visitor physical safety and security? Now, I don't just mean things like, worrying about air quality, but depending on where you are, the safety of a surrounding area. Hospitality may be in showing the employee guest their security upon arrival, escorts to cars late at night on campus. All these different ways that an organization can visibly show that you are safe and you are secure in your environment. There's also this culture of security, right? Where we in turn protect each other, right? Not letting people follow you in through doors and supporting the security that's in place. The next is designing for employee and visitor psychological security. And we're all familiar with psychological safety as this key construct that we need for high-performing teams. In healthcare, we bring it to the notion of trauma-informed design. If you're not familiar with that, may I suggest that you look that term up. Trauma-informed design is this notion that it comes from trauma-informed care, which is there are patients that come to us that have experienced all sorts of traumatic events, and there are general principles that help them feel safer in their environments. In any workplace, we have no idea what the full, true lived experience is of our employees. We do not know what they've been through in their lives, and making sure that the environment doesn't set them up for any potentially triggering or scary situations can be really important. One of them, for example, or several of them, is creating open stairwells, making sure that lines of sight are preserved, that you can see who's coming in the entrance, not designing open sitting areas where one's back would be exposed. There are these general principles around supporting access and exposure, which many of you are likely familiar with, that again do support trauma-informed design and can support that sense of psychological security. Designing for respite, so that we, again, take care of the human body and allow one to retreat when one needs to, again, by providing protection. And then designing for team or function territory, right? Giving folks a team room to call their own, right? We know that ownership, right, hosting, is territorially determined, right? So in that way, how can we create a territory where one can feel that they have that technical ownership? Hospitality is intellectual welcome. Again, looking at micro territories where employees can be hosts, and designing these affordances so that we can express it person to person and team to team at that level. The next, designing for an exchange of ideas. Now, I want to be clear here that I don't mean serendipity and silo crossing, right? We're all familiar with designing for serendipity. The spirit is different, and so is the design, right? Nothing about hospitality and intellectual welcome is random. This is incredibly purposeful, right? In numerous ancient traditions, the sharing and learning of different cultures was a critical part of the hospitality experience. So, imagine there's a team share out, and the stranger, right, who isn't a part of your team and is piqued by our conversation, is invited in as a guest, right? Do we welcome this stranger at our proverbial doorstep, invite them in to be a guest in the discussion, ready to learn and in turn share? A different way of looking at that exchange of ideas. Designing for diverse peoples and families. We do this really well, or we try to in healthcare, where we think about, for example, making sure that the patient room can accommodate families where 10 people is the baseline family. Making rooms too small and not making the affordances appropriate can make it really tough to make a family and a patient feel that they are truly welcome for who they are. Same thing in the workplace. So designing for diverse people and families with all their needs that may be there. And then, of course, neurodiversity. Hospitality is really based on making the literal and figurative space to be oneself. That is a core premise here. And neurodiversity is a fantastic example, which ties back a little bit to the safety and security. For some folks, loud noises, being exposed to the presence of others can be disturbing, as well as not providing intellectual welcome. So you can see how some of these overlap. And the last, hospitality is table fellowship, right? There is something very basic, very human, very egalitarian about the act of eating and drinking together. That lunch meeting, right? I wonder about converting this from looking at eating lunch together as multitasking, right? You're neglecting yourself by working at the same time, but rather reinforcing it as connection, right? Our colleagues down in Mexico City taught us this term sobremesa, which literally means over the table, right? Lingering at the table and enjoying the company of others. I want to point out that these are not lost hours. In healthcare, it has long been recognized that the informal conversation, the informal relationship builds up social capital, so that when you have those moments when you've got to be brisk, you've got to be brusque and take care of the patient, that you have the margin, right? The relational freedom to do so because you know each other well, right? So there's something special about that relationship, and how do we design for that more intentionally? To close up, I think this quote is so interesting and important to differentiate and to share and to show how being a new person, being a stranger and guest, is not benign, right? And I think this expression really shares it nicely. Firms, by definition, offer services to consumers in hostile environments, right? Away from safety and familiarity. This quote is about tourism, which I found so fascinating, right? This is not about healthcare. This is not about going someplace scary. This is about tourism. The tourism industry recognizes that even when going on vacation, coming to a new place is a hostile environment. And I wonder about reframing, bringing our employees back to the office, encouraging this sort of face-to-face interaction, that we really are trying to move our employees from being tourists to being locals, right? What might that onboarding process, if we look at it that way, where you don't know the rules and you don't know the language or the customs or the people, right? And for remote workers, this may take longer, right? Especially when you're coming into the physical hub once every 6 months, right? Might you remain a guest for quite some time? Do we walk around on the phone in this office? Where does one find the trash can? All these different pieces are those customs, the culture, if you will, that help an employee potentially move from tourist to local. So I love that way of thinking about it. So lastly, open thoughts, open questions and final thoughts. I do wonder, again, whether an efficient technology that meets the guest needs, whether that's in conflict with hospitality. Where does that efficiency work in? If my job to be done is avoiding interaction with people, and does providing non-human kiosk online options, for example, is that hospitality? Now, Danny Meyer certainly thought so. Right? In his book, again, Setting the Table, he talks about how he used to not allow online reservations only on the phone because he wanted his employees to really get to know the person who was making the reservation and have this sort of connection. But it occurred to him that if he didn't allow his guests to make reservations at the time that was most convenient for them, midnight, that he wasn't really showing them hospitality. And so you can now make online reservations at Grand Mystery Tavern. So I think that's an open question. The second is, will robots, chatbots, technology, hospitality didn't change for millennia, right? Our modes of human interaction were pretty constant. But as humans increasingly anthropomorphize technology, right, and report getting the same emotional feeling and connection with technology, does the role of the human change? And so, as with other service sectors, is working with a human, something that one can choose or not? I think it's an open question. Third, might the employee journey that of becoming a local, right? That of becoming a host. I think that's a fun, open thing to discover. And then the last, and this is, I think, is a concern, can the remote worker ever fully transform to a host? I had a fascinating conversation with one of my colleagues. As you know, at Miller Knoll, we do a lot of research, not only in workplace, but in healthcare, in home life, and education. And one of my colleagues who spends a lot of time looking at home life was wondering if, for example, part of the reticence to return to office may be that in my home office, I'm the host and I'm in charge, right? I have agency, I have ownership. We know in healthcare that being an agent, right, being an owner, it's really important to satisfaction at the patient level. And all of a sudden, I leave my home office where I'm number one in charge to a place where I'm not, right? I move from host to guest. And might that be some of the reticence we're seeing? I don't know. I think these are open questions for us to discuss and think about. And I really look forward to having a robust debate with all of you today. So thank you so much for your time.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Michelle. We have lots of questions for you. Great. Thank you. Just stop sharing. Well, thank you very much. Again, superb insights there. So, and Jeff, yes, I do get some superb guests, and Michelle is definitely one of those. So thank you very much for that commendation. It's great to have you. Got a few questions for you. I think you answered the one that I was going to have from this morning was, does mother rooms and well-being rooms, does that count as a part of hospitality?
I think so. It's a fundamental human need, right? It's about restoring self. That is showing hospitality, right?
Yeah, great. Well, Anne-Marie has asked, hospitality in these descriptions is about different types of care and shelter, but isn't it also about providing pleasure?
Ah, what an interesting question. Some contemporary scholars talk about that. Yes, right. That there and pleasure we see more in the contemporary hotel space, right? pleasure, surprise, delight. Now, I wouldn't say that the answer is no, but do I think you have to have the underpinning of the fundamental human need to really show hospitality? Yes, right. In ancient literature, it doesn't talk about providing pleasure. Now, as part of the exchange of ideas, there was certainly this bacchanal, right? This party and big grand hosting. So I think that's part of it, yes. But meeting that fundamental need first.
Great, thank you. I love that observation here from Ryan, that Danny Meyer's concept of enlightened hospitality in the book that you described is highly relevant for any customer-facing space.
Mm-hmm.
It's all of the space that it relates to. I think you would agree with that.
Yes.
Great. Good. Now, this is an interesting one. I don't think you'd have heard this one before. Would the security component be more prevalent in the US compared to regions with lesser instances of gun violence?
Oh, how interesting. Certainly. I mean, that may be the case. I will say, however, I was just in Mexico City visiting my colleagues down there, and there was an armed guard with a rather large weapon at the door. And I will say it made me feel much more secure. So I do think your point is very well taken. Depending on where you are, the overt showing of security may go up or down, without a doubt. But there are still different ways that we can, I mean, even the front desk staff person is a form of security, right? They're laying eyes on who happens to be coming in the building, making sure that you know where you're going. So yes, I would agree with you, but not just in the US.
Yeah, you're right. It's not just in the US. Our dealer, when I was visiting Moscow, had
Mm,
armed guards at the door. So pretty normal in some countries.
mhm.
Thank you. Grant asked the question, are there ways to go about tracking and analyzing hospitality?
Ah,
If yes, or how?
such a great question. I'm starting to explore that. So again, if we look at hospitality as being security, table fellowship, and intellectual welcome, I think we can start to measure those variables. I will say that is not how it is typically done. If you do a search and you look in the literature for how you measure hospitality, at least in healthcare, which is where I've spent most of my time, almost all the papers are measuring something else. And I do think that's because there is this confusion. I was confused when I, was going to do this topic again for the healthcare conference. I'm like, what on earth does this mean? I don't think I really understand how to design for this more thoroughly. So, I suppose it depends on what level of hospitality one is trying to measure. I think I'm advocating for capital H, right? Can we get down to those underpinnings? But certainly, I'd be curious to see if you've seen other literature in workplace that does get to these more primal, if you will, underpinnings of hospitality.
Great, thank you. A question from Elizabeth. Is there a base level or service level most companies do, or trend? Is there a base level? And I guess you talked about the coffee urn. At what point
Yeah.
does it change from being, token to being hospitality?
Well, I think part of it is in the human interaction piece. So often I see hospitality given, there's a spread of food on a table and that's hospitality. Authors would say that the human part is the really important part. Do you step it up a notch when you have a person that is delivering that to you face to face? I'm not sure if I've heard of a basic part of hospitality. Certainly, most organizations I think would say that security is their most basic form of hospitality and that they would provide that. Whether or not, the other parts are included as part of how they approach it, I'm not sure, but I think it's a great question to discuss. Thank you.
Yeah, one of the observations I wanted to make is that actually it's not what you're being served; it's often how you're being served. And
Yes.
I've been to some fantastic restaurants with the most amazing food, but I'd never go back again.
Mm.
Just because of the whole experience. So it's that interesting thing. And I've been to some pretty good dives, but they have a fantastic atmosphere. You go
Right,
back there, you know what I mean? So
right, right.
it
Yeah,
is.
it is. Well,
Um,
the other thing I would say is that, and if I'm wrong, please comment and let us know, that I wonder if you're asking from the perspective of the employee as guest, right? And I think what we're arguing here is that we want to shift the employee from being a guest to being a host, where they're in charge of these things, right? So, you know, they know how to find and how to get what they need because it's provided for them, right? So I think that that's the difference here.
Great. Well, thank you. A question from Laura. I found your connections with trauma-informed design and neurodiversity in the workplace very compelling. Are we seeing changes in the workplace with regards to neurodivergence in the workplace?
Oh, certainly. I think we get asked that every day. You know, how to allow a person, you know, I'll go by need rather than type, right? Who might need less stimulation or, you know, need to be able to get away, that opportunity and that affordance is provided within the workplace itself, and that you don't have to go someplace else. In healthcare, we're certainly seeing this. And right now, actually, we have a collaboration that we are working with Jefferson Health in the United States, creating a chair that is specifically supporting the needs of neurodiverse patients with their need for fiddling, right, on the arm cap, and then a visual barrier, if you will, that's part of lounge furniture, and that's going to be coming out later this fall. So yes, I do think we're seeing this more and more. It's not hard to do, actually, and quite honestly, most of us and many of us would benefit, right, from being able to get away and not be so visually exposed and be able to focus. You know, the needs of the neurodiverse are really the needs of all of us. All of us are neurodiverse, essentially, right? It's just the spectrum.
Yeah, great. I just want to highlight some observations from Judy. She's talked about hotels do tracking of hospitality and uses the term GSTS and MSTS, and I don't know what that means. I thought that was
Look
interesting.
that up.
Having a multilingual staff does help. And she also talked about the role of concierge almost.
Mm.
That is where you make guests feel welcome as well.
Yes, we've talked
Okay.
about that, whether or not, you know, concierge services at an organization might be helpful, especially if you have visitors that are frequently coming, right? And they can take over some of those roles of explaining where and how things are done. But I think part of the open question for us is, should employees start to be able to take more of that on themselves, where at the individual team level, they host each other, right? And they are able to provide for each other, knowing what those needs are: security, safety, right? Table fellowship, intellectual welcome.
We're 5 minutes from the hour, and I try to give people at least a break before their next meeting.
Oh,
This has been fascinating. I can only finish by one comment. I want to read your book, but I already checked Google and don't think you've written one yet.
oh,
So, so that is a compliment and a half for what I think was an outstanding session.
oh my goodness.
Michelle, thank you very much.
Glad to be here. So interesting to learn from you today. I can't wait to look through the comments. So thank you for writing them. We really appreciate it.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone.